These large bones that make up the prominent cheek bones are the zygomatic bones. This is a zygomatic bone, and this is a zygomatic bone. From the side, we see the zygomatic bone here. The part of the zygomatic bone that extends back towards the temporal bone is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. You'll note now that the zygomatic bone has a temporal process, and the temporal bone has a zygomatic process. This zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone make up the zygomatic arch. This, you'll remember, was the ethmoid bone. This smaller bone is the lacrimal bone. We have part of the maxilla that is coming up here. And right on the top or bridge of the nose, we have a nasal bone. On the other side, again, we have the ethmoid, the lacrimal, part of the maxilla, and on the bridge of the nose, the nasal bone. The other part of the nasal septum is the vomer bone. Remember, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid came down and joined with another bone, that being the vomer bone that comes up, extends up, and reaches the perpendicular plate. And the vomer, along with the perpendicular plate, make up the nasal septum. This would be the vomer bone. Inside the nasal cavity, we see two bones that curl inward from the outside wall. These are the inferior nasal concha, here and here. Inferior nasal concha. The mandible is the lower jawbone. The parts that you need to know include the mental foramen. This is a small hole here and also on the other side where blood vessels and nerves enter this bone. The mandibular condyle, which is the rounded extension that articulates with the rest of the skull, and the coronoid process, this thinner, more pointed projection. So the mandible has the mental foramen, the mandibular condyle, and the coronoid process. There are also three pair of small bones located in the middle ear called the ossicles. You probably learned them as the hammer, which is correctly named the malleus, the anvil, which is correctly named the incus, and the stirrup, which is correctly named the stapes. Not really one of the skull bones, but listed here is the hyoid. The hyoid bone sits on top of the larynx and helps to support the larynx. The hyoid bone. The immovable joints between the cranial bones are called sutures. This suture is called the coronal suture. The coronal suture separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. Running down the middle of the skull is the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture divides or separates the right parietal from the left parietal bone. This is the squamosal suture. The squamosal suture separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone. This is the squamosal suture. The lambdoidal suture separates the occipital bone from the parietal bones. This is the lambdoidal suture. During fetal development, the bones of the skull are not fused together. And at this point between the frontal bones and the parietal bones,